Okay. First of all, thanks very much to Tom Slater for inviting me to be here today. It's a great pleasure. And also to Paul Kirkness for all of his fantastic coordination of travel and lodging and food arrangements. Hugely important, of course. Loic apologized yesterday for speaking to his colleagues in French, or in English, in Paris, and as maybe the only American on the panel across these 2 days, I apologize for speaking English in Paris as well. I'm also probably going to speak very fast because I have a lot here that I'm trying to squeeze in. So, the state of Illinois currently incarcerates more than 49,000 inmates on any given day. Upwards of 36,000 are released each year. Roughly 2/3 of this number, or 25,000 inmates a day, that's a charter busload each day, or 25,000 a year, return to the west and south sides of Chicago, where black male unemployment exceeds 45%, even before ex-felons return home. The numbers involved in these estimates comprise a veritable crisis that has come under the name of prisoner reentry. This is a growing policy obsession in the U.S. at the state, federal, and municipal levels. From George Bush's 2008 Second Chance Act to the 2009 Illinois Crime Reduction Act to numerous municipal policy and practice initiatives at the Cook County Jail in Chicago, the reentry imperative operates across multiple scales and along multiple administrative fronts. It's been fueled by a convergence of disparate ideological positions and the formation of novel political coalitions among policy elites as the regulatory framework of mass incarceration has increasingly become more untenable. A central component of the Illinois reentry imperative is the Sheridan Correctional Center, a medium security prison, state prison located 70 miles southwest of Chicago. This is Sheridan out here, the kind of outer suburban development of the McMansions and so on end about here. So it really is a kind of authentic cornfield town in Illinois, 2,000 residents, 2,000 inmates. Billed as the nation's largest and only fully dedicated substance abuse treatment prison, and the only program of its kind that's medium security, the Sheridan Correctional Center is a bold experiment in the history of criminal justice reform. In our current economic and political crisis, Sheridan has been framed as a hopeful and potentially replicable model for changing the way in which the criminal justice system addresses the complicated nexus between addiction, urban poverty, and recidivism. It was opened in 2004 with an eye toward pathways and channels to reentry in communities, both in terms of neighborhoods and social service delivery systems. So to date, I've conducted 1 year of ethnographic fieldwork inside the walls at Sheridan Correctional Center. The last ethnographic project conducted in an Illinois State Prison was written by James Jacobs, who was a student of Norval Morris, that Loic mentioned yesterday. Stateville is one of Illinois' most famous maximum security prisons. This is the last standing panopticon in the United States in Joliet, Illinois. This is another photo of it as well. The original architects of Stateville actually went to England to study Jeremy Bentham's design in 1925 and went back and created 4 of these roundhouses originally. Here's an aerial view of Stateville. Here's a photo from the 60s of inmates playing baseball next to these. And this is today. All of the roundhouses have been dismantled with the exception of this one. This is F House, which is also known as the bird cage. So my attempt here is to kind of bring James Jacobs' study up to date in a different penitentiary. My ethnographic field work, I will forego most of that. I was kind of hoping there might be time in Q&A if anybody did have questions about inmate life in the prison. That's what I've been focused on in the last year. But for today's purpose, I want to offer an account of how Sheridan came into being, as well as why and how it continues to persist in an era of unprecedented fiscal austerity. Sheridan costs a lot of money, as I'll talk about a little bit later. It's $43,000 per bed annually for an inmate to be there. In most Illinois prisons, like Stateville, for example, it's about $23,000 a year. So there is a question of how this has managed to survive the budgetary crisis in Illinois that I want to think about. And I also want to index a series of theoretical and philosophical arguments as a kind of placeholder for ongoing and future thinking about the meaning of Sheridan for theories of political economy and governmentality. On both accounts, my analysis is meant to provide an inroad for consideration of how substance abuse treatment works as an ancillary modality of criminal justice to resolve the crises of recidivism, reentry, and prison overcrowding, and also excessive costs. These are the most visible symptoms of the regulatory framework of mass incarceration, and the increasing pressure on costs has led to context-specific forms of regulatory experimentation, and I'm conceiving of Sheridan in this way. So Loic spoke yesterday about the explosive growth of the U.S. prison system since 1970. This is well documented. I won't rehearse this history here. The numbers involved with that explosive growth have an almost numbing effect. The historical explanations for the incarceration boom are broad and diverse. They range from post-industrial decline to globalization to shifts in sentencing laws, to the war on drugs, to welfare state retrenchment. In the interest of time, I want to focus on just one here, and that is the putative decline and eclipse of rehabilitative frameworks in prisons, right, since the 1970s. The most extensive review of this trend has been done by David Garland, whose books on 20th century criminal justice map the transition from what he calls penal welfarism, which held sway from 1900 to 1970, to what many critics have described as an actuarial turn in punishment policy or as neoliberal penality. In describing the penal welfarist era, Garland sketched the monopoly that clinicians, such as social workers, psychiatrists, psychologists, even sociologists, once held in the prison, right, over when guys would get out, over the reasons for their being there, and so on. Since then, Garland contends the correctional facility has reduced its rehabilitative ambition to ground zero, whereas in the penal welfare era, the core assumptions of criminology were premised on a faith in the perfectibility of man. Crime was perceived as the sign of an underachieving socialization process, and society looked to the state in many regards and its clinical expertise for social adjustment. Contemporary criminology, by contrast, is widely said to disavow the rehabilitative agenda of normalization and instead views crime as routine, committed by individuals who are, for all intents and purposes, just like you or I. They just made irrational choices. Offenders are now envisaged as rational economic actors, pace Gary Becker. Now, I simply couldn't find a way to make this argument efficiently, so I'm just going to kind of skip over this. It is very difficult to talk about the mass incarceration boom, if not impossible to talk about neoliberal penality. Bernard Harcourt, my colleague at the University of Chicago, has done this recently by sketching two trajectories in the Chicago School of Law and Economics that have been very instrumental in defining crime in such a way that accords with the economic imperatives of neoliberalism, but also that results in mass incarceration. Gary Becker, who's the leading economist and kind of heir to the throne of Milton Friedman, still very much active at the University of Chicago, and Richard Posner in the law school have been at the forefront of this movement. This is a recent meeting, by the way, of Françoise Velde, a former student of Michel Foucault, meeting in April with Gary Becker to discuss Foucault's 1979 lectures on Gary Becker. But Harcourt sketches these two lineages, from Adam Smith to Friedrich von Hayek to Ronald Coase to Epstein on the one hand, and more importantly from Bentham and his notion of welfare utilitarianism through Gary Becker to Richard Posner on crime. Ultimately, Posner, Becker, and Epstein converge on a similar view of political economy and punishment that becomes institutionalized in the Chicago School of Law and Economics. So I'll just kind of get quickly here to the way in which Posner ultimately defines crime, as I think this is quite important. The major function of criminal law in a capitalist society is to prevent people from bypassing the system of voluntary compensated exchange. The market, explicit or implicit, in situations where, because transaction costs are low, the market is virtually by definition the most efficient method of allocating resources. Attempts to bypass the market will therefore be discouraged by a legal system bent on promoting efficiency. So offenders here in the actuarial turn are envisaged as rational economic actors, responsive to disincentives, fully responsible for their own actions. This leads to a theory and rationality of criminology that strongly reinforces retributive and deterrent policies, and crime is explained no longer on a theory of individual deprivation. You no longer need anthropological knowledge of the subject, his broken home, his relationship to his mother, and so on, right? But rather, crime is explained as an outgrowth of inadequate controls that can be governed through risk management strategies. So the categories here have shifted towards actuarial categories, but I will argue the state is still necessary to create actuarial subjects. So I can't give a full-scale historical analysis of this second phase of penology, but suffice it to say that the disappearance of rehabilitative programming has been a central part in the literature on this turn, and also the disappearance of rehabilitation is posited as a central component of neoliberal penality. By Garland's own admission, however, we would be wise to take precautions when dealing with broad brushstrokes and historical periodizations. Any complex multidimensional field undergoing transformation will show signs of continuity and discontinuity as institutionally inherited landscapes are reworked en route to new welfare settlements. So bearing in mind these precautions, it seems that something is happening in recent machinations of prison reform in the early 21st century. And I want to suggest today that we may not quite know what it is, right? Although I think certainly Loïc gave a very compelling and totalized description of the second period of penality. I'm suggesting here that something new might be happening in the era of fiscal austerity. The resolution of the consequences and failures and fallout and crises of mass incarceration in the actuarial turn have perhaps entered us into a new phase for consideration. And the Illinois version of the carceral boom certainly points us in this direction. So I've taken quite a detour here. Now I come back to my actual field site. Illinois has experienced its own exceptionally aggressive incarceration boom. The state's prison population doubled from 1973 to 1982. It doubled again by 91. It rose another 55% by the close of the 90s. To put it more simply, we had 20,000 inmates in 1987. This morning I looked, we had 49,116. So that's a 2.5%, or 200, more than double. To accommodate the population growth, Illinois built 21 prisons between 1980 and 2004. Okay. We now have 27 prisons with 31,000 beds and 50,000 inmates. So you see we have an overcrowding problem as well. Sheridan was introduced. These are all some of Illinois' prison facilities across the state. Most of them are far downstate from Chicago, in very rural communities. These are prison industries making fabric for the uniforms. This is a kind of a typical cell that's doubled up. The Sheridan Correctional Center, where my field work takes place, was engineered to solve the current crises of recidivism and overcrowding through the reemergence of substance abuse programming. It was originally opened as a juvenile center in 1941. It turned adult in 1971. It was closed for 2 years between 2002 and 2004, and then reopened in a very kind of interesting way. The story here is that the early advocates for Sheridan reopening as a substance abuse treatment prison took note of the state's highest recidivism rates in history. In around 2000, 55% of inmates were coming out of the prisons and being reincarcerated within 3 years. Almost 2/3, or 66%, that is 2/3, were being rearrested on various crimes. So the early architects of Sheridan paid close attention to these rising recidivism rates, also the rising cost of incarceration along many respects. These are some of Obama's key people, among them Valerie Jarrett, who's Obama's right-hand advisor, but there are also local private public players in Chicago that are quite important power brokers. They then convinced Congressman Rod Blagojevich, who some of you may know from reality television shows, is a former Illinois governor who's now in prison, like several of our former Illinois governors. Rod Blagojevich, when he was a congressman, actually had illusions of becoming president of the United States. And he told these reformers if they made a national program, he would make it a Gold Star initiative, he would back it, but it had to be the biggest and the best, right? So they literally studied best practices. They showed some evidence that substance abuse treatment reduced recidivism. And Blagojevich said, well, we need an entire prison, not a small program as many prisons have of 80 guys and then a larger population of 1,800 in general population, but the entire prison devoted to substance abuse intensive therapeutic community treatment. And that's exactly what was created in 2004. This is the Sheridan compound. This morning the census was 1,680 inmates, and the development and planning for this leads to three national trends in prison reform. First, we're seeing a crisis in the rising costs of incarceration, made even more acute, of course, by the financial collapse of 2008. Illinois has a terrible budget crisis right now. It has a state annual budget of $25 billion US. $1.5 billion of that goes to the prisons. So the night watchman state may be at an anemic state, but the iron fist, the somewhat monolithic institution of the prison, is alive and well and still heavily funded. Nonetheless, in the wake of unprecedented expenditures and the fiscal crisis, a strange consensus has emerged from strange political bedfellows. Christian fundamentalists, progressives, prisoners' rights activists, fiscal conservatives, libertarians are all in agreement that this model is simply too expensive and does not work. With 25,000 guys coming back to Chicago, it's actually being conceived as a kind of drain on the region. This has brought an increase in public and political attention to the costly problems of recidivism and overcrowding at the federal, state, and municipal levels. And as a large part of this has been delivered and disseminated through the proliferation of substance abuse treatment models to address the prison crisis. This is what I wrote about in my first book on Philadelphia, the growing intersection in policy and practice between criminal justice, substance abuse recovery, and urban social welfare, which has catalyzed a new wave of substance abuse treatment models employed in prison administration, probation and parole, programming and housing, and reentry programming. So almost all parties now agree that the austere, tough-on-crime approach of providing inmates with $50 at the gate and wishing them good luck to get a bus home is simply too costly for the region. But they also agree you have to spend money to save money. So suddenly, rehabilitation is back. At the heart of this study lies a very tentative hypothesis that we may have entered a new third phase in the history of prison reform. The current trend partially harkens back to the rehabilitative era of penal welfarism, although it should be noted that there are no attempts to rehabilitate all programs or all prisoners, and the Supermax warehouse prison is still very much intact to buttress the sparsely distributed, if surely emergent, rehabilitative efforts. But in order to truly understand Sheridan, I think we have to consider it in a much broader light, in terms of how it resonates and articulates with larger political and economic arrangements. So let me quickly offer here, in closing, three provisional explanations for the prison's persistence. In other words, why has it survived? Why does it keep being funded, even with the great hostility around budgetary debates in the politics of Springfield, Illinois? First, as Garland shows, the decentering of the state's specialist institutions and the criminal rationalities that sustained them in the actuarial period have led to an expanded infrastructure of reentry, crime prevention, community safety, preventative partnerships, safer cities programs, business improvement districts, neighborhood watch, all these kinds of strange bedfellows that are oriented toward new objectives and priorities: security, prevention, harm reduction, fear reduction. These are all low-key efforts to build up the control of neighborhoods and to encourage communities to police themselves. And recovery, I think, fits in with this. Today we see a development that enlists the activity of citizens, communities, and companies working with a more expansive conception of crime control, utilizing techniques and strategies that are quite different from those used by traditional criminal justice agencies. I have a clock here, so all right, I'll try to move quickly. Second, as Loic is talking about, reentry becomes a kind of myth and ceremony of bureaucratic ceremony, and not about industrial economy. As I see it, in Illinois, there are three ways of doing prisoner reentry. The first is you can try your luck at formal employment, which is almost dead on arrival. The second is you can go into an entrepreneurial training program. I sat through one of these. It's a 10-week mini MBA kind of process where at the end, if you write a business plan, you can get a low-interest loan. This is kind of, for those who are fans of The Wire, the Stringer Bell approach, right? Of teaching, the idea being that ghetto hustlers are natural-born capitalists. They have an aversion to centralized authority. They simply need to code switch from the informal to the formal side of the economy. And the third is recovery, I think, right, where the state is very much involved in producing recovery and addiction programs. Recovery has come to be seen as a problem in and of itself. So a lot of these guys come out of prison and they try to get around some sort of social service program, a halfway house, an intensive outpatient program, a politician who gets trickle-down stimulus dollars, right, from the Obama plan to start some sort of program, to become professional speakers in high schools, to become paraprofessional counselors. In a sense, they become in recovery in perpetuity, right? This becomes their job. There is no idea anymore that they will be formally integrated back into employment. And in this sense, recovery comes to embody what my colleague Lauren Berlant refers to as a cruel optimism. The affective structure associated with increasing precarity in the face of waning sovereignty and dissolving assurances. Amidst the fraying of contemporary fantasies of upward mobility, job security, gainful employment even, recovery becomes somewhat doubly cruel insofar as it entails being inside a relation that becomes sustaining regardless of the content of the relation. Recovery for the ex-offender entails becoming bound to a set of practices, rituals, and discourses that simultaneously come to churn the subject in regulatory eddies, at the same time that the recovery narrative becomes profoundly affirming. Right? So finally, what I'd like to suggest then, is where Loic had us, at least in part of his talk yesterday, is the idea of Sheridan's surviving its resonance and articulation with emergent political, popular, and professional cultural development in recent years, which enables us to see how local and regional political systems play a great role in mediating, neutralizing, or even contradicting national trends. And in this regard, I've started to conceive and envisage Sheridan as a kind of patronage system, right? The double movement here are social service providers and the inmates themselves clamoring here for the only public dollars that are available. This has very much replaced the old patronage system of the Daley regime, for example, which was around streets and sanitation jobs and city jobs, instead around these kind of social service programming and being in recovery and perpetuity that operates as something of an ancillary modality, a regulatory framework for churning these types of bodies. Now, I don't know, I was kind of hoping Loic was here today so we could take up this idea of the impossibility of neoliberal governmentality. I do think there is something historically novel here, although there's a great deal of continuity. To the extent to which what the activation of subjects, citizens, and social service providers are very important here in remaking the state, right, and also in remaking markets. And the extent to which this happens through the aspirations, hopes, and dreams of inmates, I think does suggest something that's a little bit different than the framework that Loic offered to us yesterday. So thank you very much for this.
Very interesting. So, any question, please?
Just a empirical question or two. Does it work? I mean, does this prison that you're studying work better than, in terms of recidivity? Is it having any sort of effect? That,
Yeah. Okay,
that's the first one.
Sure.
The second one is, you seem to be talking about this transformation, but if we zoom on the war on drugs,
Yeah.
you still see in the last 20 years the percentage of money that goes into punishment and rehabilitation have not changed that much.
Right.
So does this model is this prison signaling what is in the in the future, or is just
I think, I mean, just to start on the second question, I don't think so. I think now it's very uneven, right? There's this small scale kind of reform impulses. They're idiosyncratic. They're delivered by charismatic political figures. They're around the edges and weak spots, I think. Mass incarceration, I don't think is going anywhere soon. But it's an interesting moment in the sense that now you have fiscal conservatives and libertarians and neoliberals alike agreeing that this $1.5 billion out of a $25 billion budget is really astounding, right? So I think that there is some. That's why I titled this talk: "Is it reform or is it redistribution?" I think there's some redistribution of those dollars at the periphery here of social service provision to bridge these guys back. Whereas previously they were literally getting between $10 and $50 at the gate to go home, right? So there has been some minor evidence to suggest that. Now, as far as your first question, does it work? I mean, it's as a person who's in a policy school, that's typically a question that I chafe at, right? I think it's the wrong question to ask on a lot of levels. I think it's more important to ask what types of effects does this type of regulatory experimentation produce in restructuring the state, the market, and the civil society, and so on. But there is some quantitative research that does show if you do this program all the way through, which includes 3 months of very intensive probation under treatment, you're something like 40% less likely to recidivate than the normal guy who went to just a regular prison, right? If they don't complete this aftercare part, it drops down to about 16%, which makes the whole prison part kind of a black box in a way. I mean, that's not nothing of an effect, but considering these guys are doing groups, this is the other amazing thing. This is prison, and they get buzzed out of their cells in a room like this with 25 guys circling 2 guys in the middle who are having a face-off, for 4-hour group sessions, 7 days a week. And for that kind of effect, right, for the type of social service contracts that are going into the prison, it's questionable, right? I think it does work to deconcentrate and destabilize the old social ecology of the prison, which operates on 2 codes of being, the guards code and the inmate code, right? So you have gangs and guards. When a third party of treatment providers comes in there, and the idea is to kind of individualize everybody's psychology and their bad choices again, that does have a very deconcentrating effect on gang power, right? It also destabilizes the guards' power. So it works in that regard. It becomes a kind of insidious inmate management strategy in a way. The therapeutic community strategy is very much about confrontation of your peers, rigorous honesty, what the inmates call snitching, right? So I think it produces effects without question. I'm not so optimistic about the recidivism myself.
Another question? Specific issues. But so just a small question for in the future. There is possible to enlarge this experience at the national level, also, or with the local best practices, but it's impossible to.
I don't think they could bring it to scale with the population, with 2.5 million incarcerated. It's just simple. We already have no money, right?
So just only market.
Yeah. So, I mean, it costs almost twice as much money to house these guys because of all the social workers in the prison, right? So you would have to seriously decarcerate and highly, reduce the prison population, at least in the near future, right? Where municipalities are so incredibly burdened by the pension obligations right now that anything innovative or experimental in social policy has been deemed impossible for the next 15 to 20 years.
So last
Sorry,
short
this is
question,
quick.
please.
Sorry to ask another does it work question, but what
Yeah,
are
no,
the,
it's
what are
fine.
the
Sorry, I
effects,
didn't mean to, it's a blast, what does it work?
Don't
question.
ask. Sorry.
what are the effects on substance use?
Well, that's very tied to recidivism because they're heavily monitored with daily urine streams, right? So most of these guys, their success, if they're not recidivating, is pretty closely measured to their clean urines because 2/3 of the people in prison in the U.S. are nonviolent offenders, right? Most of them are either dealing drugs or getting high and doing low-level property crimes to stay high, right? So if they, if they're, most of them are also in violation of parole, that's why they get re-incarcerated. And the most common factor for that is dirty urines. Right? So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Change horizon. So we are going back to focalize our attention to